There are crimes that chill you. Then there are crimes that rot in your gut. This is the second kind. We're not talking about garden variety violence, not a shooting, not a stabbing, not even a cold, calculated poisoning. This is about turning death into dinner. Not for survival, not for hunger, but to vanish a human being in the most primal, revolting way imaginable, by feeding them to animals. Some did it to cover their tracks. Others called it practical. A few didn't even bother explaining, because to them it made perfect sense. They used pigs, dogs, and even house pets, not as companions but as accomplices. This is the kind of evil that doesn't just end a life, it digests it. Let's start with a man from China whose dogs never barked at intruders because they were too busy chewing on them. Chung Pang, dogs at the door, bones in the kennel. Imagine walking past your neighbor's yard. A few dogs are lounging in the dust, quiet, their eyes following you but never barking. Strange, you think. Dogs usually bark, especially here in Inner Mongolia, where watchdogs are part of life. But these ones, silent, too silent. Behind those eyes was the secret of Chung Pang. He wasn't famous, he wasn't feared. He was just another man with another house, the kind of person you'd forget after one glance. And maybe that's why he managed to do what he did for years, kill people, cut their bodies apart and feed them to his dogs. It started in the mid-1990s. People on the margins disappeared. A drifter here, a lonely acquaintance there, someone who didn't make it home. At first, no one connected the dots. Life was hard. People vanished for all kinds of reasons. But if you'd followed those trails, most would have ended at Chung Pang's door. Inside, he had a pack of dogs, big, heavy animals, always fed, always calm. Too calm, because Chung had trained them without even meaning to. Every time blood hit the floor, every time a body was cut up, the dogs learned. The smell of blood wasn't a warning. It wasn't danger. It was dinner. He killed, he carved, and he dumped the flesh into their troughs. Neighbors thought he just had well-fed dogs. Investigators later realized those kennels had swallowed more than scraps. They had swallowed people. The horror wasn't just the killing. It was the erasure. No bodies, no graves, no evidence. Teeth shattered bones, stomachs dissolved tissue. By the time anyone asked questions, the victims were gone, reduced to nothing but silence and fattened dogs pacing their pens. When police finally searched Chung's property, they found stains in the floor, tools for cutting, and animals too healthy for the scraps a poor man could afford. And when Chung confessed, it wasn't with wild theatrics. It was with cold practicality. Yes, he had killed. Yes, he had fed the bodies to the dogs. That was it. To him, it was simple. To the rest of the world, it was monstrous. The case horrified China. People who had loved their dogs for centuries now shuddered at the thought of what these animals had been forced to eat. Families who had been searching for their missing loved ones learned the cruelest truth of all. There would be no grave to visit, no remains to hold on to. Just the knowledge that their sons, daughters, brothers and friends had been erased in the most degrading way imaginable. Chung Pang was executed in 1998. His dogs were put down as well, though they had never chosen their role in this nightmare. They were victims too, turned into accomplices by hunger and training. The real villain had always been Chung, a man who saw not loyalty in his dogs but utility. To him, they weren't companions. They were garbage disposals, and just when people thought the nightmare was over, another story broke. Another man, in the very same country, was doing something even darker. He wasn't just feeding human flesh to dogs. He was cutting it, drying it and selling it in markets, labeling it not as pork, not as beef, but as ostrich meat, Zhang Yongming. Ostrich meat and the dogs that never asked. On market days in rural Yunnan, the lanes fill with steam and smoke and the soft thud of cleavers on wood. Stalls line the road, spices in little pyramids, baskets of greens, skewers charring over coals, and at one table a man with a quiet face lays out thin, dark strips of dried meat. The hand-painted sign says ostrich. He smiles without really smiling. Customers lean in, sniff, haggle, buy. The man is Zhang Yongming. And if you were hungry enough, unlucky enough, or simply trusting enough, you might have walked away chewing on something that never came from a bird. The disappearances began near a narrow path by a patch of trees. Young men mostly, drifting between jobs, students passing through, sons who promised to be home by dinner and simply weren't. Families posted notices. They searched the alleys, the bus depots, the places where someone in trouble might go. When they asked around, certain details repeated like an echo. Last seen near the bend in the road. Last seen not far from the quiet man's house. Last seen, then never seen again. Zhang's home looked ordinary from the lane. But if you stepped behind where the sun hit hard and the flies gathered, you'd see things that shouldn't have been there. Strips hung to dry. A pot that was always on, even when no one seemed to be cooking. Dogs that hovered close, too excited around the scent of meat, too quick to learn that the scraps thrown their way would always come, no matter who failed to come home. He hunted in routine, lure, attack, dismember, feed the dogs, dry the rest. The method was blunt, but the cover was effective. In a place where homemade jerky is just part of the landscape, a few extra strings of meat don't spark alarm. Not at first. The families did not stop. They pressed police. They walked the fields. Some ended up near Zhang's property and wondered about the smoke, the smell that clung to fabric, the barking that cut off suddenly, as if a door had closed on it. Rumors grew, the kind you don't want to believe. He sells ostrich, someone would say. Ostrich? Another would repeat and then shrug. Who's to say what ostrich smells like when it's dried? Who's to say what truth hides behind a handwritten sign? When officers finally came with a purpose, to search, not just to glance, they found bones where bones shouldn't be. They found tools that didn't belong to a hobby butcher. They found dogs too fat for the scraps a quiet man could afford. And in the places only he went, they found meat that had been cut, rinsed, hung, and labeled like a product. Nothing about Zhang felt feverish. He wasn't ranting or theatrical. He moved with the dull patience of someone who had settled on a system and stuck to it. Dogs were not pets in his world. They were part of the process. They cleaned what he didn't sell. They erased what he couldn't hide. And because dogs don't testify, he believed the truth would never have a voice. It took time to connect the missing to the meat. It took longer to admit the scale of the failure. How many warnings were brushed aside? How many families were told to wait? How many market days came and went while a killer worked under the morning sun? When the pieces finally fit, the picture was indecently simple. A path where young men disappeared, a house that turned people into product, a stall that wrapped horror in paper and string. In the end, Zhang faced the courts. The polite sign that said ostrich was not a defense. The dogs were not a shield. He was convicted, and the sentence was the one reserved for crimes that make a nation cold from the inside out. Execution ended the man. It didn't end the questions. How do you recognize danger when it wears the face of a neighbor? How do you hear the families before the rumor becomes a body? How do you look at a marketplace and not wonder what exactly is being sold? What lingers is the feeling of deception so complete it became mundane. The meat wasn't exotic. It was a lie written in everyday letters. The dogs weren't monsters. They were instruments, taught to wait, taught to eat, taught without knowing, to erase. And the victims weren't missing persons in some abstract ledger. They were sons who never made the call, friends who left bowls cooling on tables, lives reduced to a price per kilo, and a nod from a vendor who didn't blink. This is the logic these cases share. If you want to make a person vanish, turn the body into something ordinary. Animal feed, kitchen stock, dried strips on a piece of twine between two nails. Hide in plain sight and let people's hunger do the rest. Across the ocean and far from Yunnan's markets, another predator learned the same lesson. He didn't bother with signs or stall fronts. He didn't need to. He had a farm, a pen full of pigs, and a city that kept losing women in all the ways cities lose people. Where Zhang's customers walked away with little paper bags, this man's animals walked away with something else, the evidence. What Zhang did with dogs, another man would do with pigs. Only this time the scale was larger, the cruelty colder, and the victims were women from a city that kept losing them. Their trail didn't vanish into shadows, it ended in the mud of a Canadian farm. Robert Pickton, the pig farm that swallowed the missing. On the streets of Vancouver's downtown east side, the walls once seemed papered with missing faces. Posters stapled to poles, taped to bus shelters, plastered to the windows of corner stores. Young women, middle-aged women, some with big smiles, some with tired eyes. Most came from the same neighborhood, and almost all were ignored by the people who should have been looking hardest. For years, families begged police to listen. They told them their daughters, sisters, and mothers didn't just wander off. They knew something was wrong. But the same answer came back again and again. She'll turn up. The women were dismissed as runaways, drug users, sex workers, people whose lives were written off before they even ended, except they didn't turn up. And when the truth finally came out, it was worse than any family had feared, because the women weren't vanishing into thin air. They were being driven 20 miles outside the city to a muddy, trash-strewn farm in Port Coquitlam, and there they were swallowed whole. The farm belonged to Robert Willie Pickton. To some, he was the oddball farmer who threw rowdy parties for bikers and locals, a greasy man in blood-stained overalls, wandering between his pens. Strange, yes. Dangerous? Few thought so. But behind those fences, Pickton built a place where evidence could vanish. Pigs eat everything. Farmers have known this for centuries. Scraps, bones, rotten leftovers, it doesn't matter. In Pickton's hands, that simple fact became a weapon. Victims were lured to his farm, often with the promise of drugs, money, or just a ride out of the city. Once there, they were trapped. He killed them. How, in every case, still isn't certain. But what came after was always the same. Their bodies were fed to pigs. Screams were masked by the noise of the pens. Blood mixed with the stink of manure. The pigs, starved and restless, devoured what they were given. And when the animals were finished, whatever fragments remained could be tossed into barrels, ground up, or rendered down into something unrecognizable. Even food byproducts that may have entered the supply chain. It was disposal, perfected by cruelty. For years, the women kept disappearing. Families kept asking questions, and the city kept turning away. But in 2002, a firearms investigation finally led police to search Pickton's property. What they found there still stands as one of the largest crime scenes in Canadian history. Excavators rolled across the mud. Forensic teams in hazmat suits sifted through pig troughs, barns, and soil by the bucketful. Every inch of the farm was combed, and the discoveries were unbearable. Bones, fragments, DNA traces that tied the farm directly to the missing women of Vancouver, belongings half buried in the muck, freezers that held pieces no one wanted to describe. What they could never find were full bodies. The pigs had done their work too well. Pickton was charged with 26 murders. In 2007, he was convicted of 6. He bragged in jail that the real number was 49 and that he had wanted to make it an even 50. Whether he was boasting or confessing hardly mattered. Everyone knew the true scale of his crimes was larger than the charges on paper. The trial laid bare the failures of the system. Police had been warned years earlier. Families had begged for action. But nothing was done until dozens were gone. The women weren't faceless. They were daughters, sisters, mothers. And yet their lives had been dismissed as disposable, just like their bodies would later be. For the families, the knowledge of what happened was almost harder than the loss itself. There were funerals with no remains, vigils with nothing to hold on to but photographs. To imagine a loved one reduced to feed for animals was more than grief. It was humiliation, an insult that left scars generations deep. Robert Pickton would never walk free. But in the end, he would also never live out the quiet, forgotten old age so many feared. In May 2024, he was attacked by another inmate at Port Cartier Institution in Quebec. Days later, he died in hospital. One of Canada's most notorious serial killers was gone. His death did not bring peace. For the families, it was another reminder of how many answers they would never get, how many victims would never be properly accounted for. The farm was bulldozed years earlier, but the memory of what happened there can't be buried. Not under concrete, not under time. Pickton thought pigs could erase the evidence. He thought the noise of a farm could drown out the screams. He thought no one would notice when women on the margins disappeared. For years, he was right. And that might be the darkest part of all. Not the killings themselves, but how long the world let him get away with them. And half a world away, in the cold steel of a Russian apartment, another predator found his own way to make flesh disappear. Only this time, it wasn't pigs in muddy pens. It was a dog sitting on the kitchen floor waiting for scraps. And helping the killer lure his victims inside was his mother. Alexander Spesivtsev, the apartment of shadows, Novokuznetsk, Siberia. A city built on coal and steel where smoke clings to the air and the cold bites even in spring. Apartment blocks stand like grey monoliths, windows stacked one on top of the other, each one hiding lives no outsider will ever know. And in one of those apartments, behind a thin wooden door, lived a killer who turned his home into a chamber of death. His name was Alexander Spesivtsev. His neighbors called him odd, withdrawn, a man who kept to himself. But what no one truly understood was that the heart of his crimes beat not only in his own cruelty, but in the complicity of someone who should have been his protector. His mother, Lyudmila. Together they created a place where trust ended at the threshold. The victims were not chosen from power or status. They were the vulnerable. Runaways, homeless children, young girls who lingered too long on the streets. Lyudmila would approach them, often with food or offers of shelter. Her grey hair and maternal tone disarmed suspicion. Who would fear an old woman offering help? But once inside the Spesivtsev apartment, the trap was sprung. Alexander, tall and gaunt, waited behind the door. The screams that followed were muffled by walls that had already absorbed too much. Victims were beaten, tortured, and killed. Some reports suggest his cruelty was fueled by delusions, a twisted worldview shaped by years of psychiatric confinement and bitterness. But whatever the motive, the outcome was the same. Children and young women entered the apartment and never came out. And then came the dog. In the corner of the room beside the clutter and filth sat an animal that had learned to eat what no creature should ever be given. Spesivtsev didn't bother with careful disposal. He hacked apart the bodies, feeding parts to his dog and discarding the rest in crude ways. Some remains were dumped in the River Tom, wrapped in bags that sometimes surfaced, sparking whispers and dread in the city. Others were left to rot inside the apartment itself, the smell leaking into the stairwell, though neighbors never dared press too hard. Imagine that space. Peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, stains that never scrubbed out. A mother and son living side by side with the echo of screams and the stench of decay. And a dog gnawing at bones under the kitchen table. This wasn't a farm or a vast property. It was a single apartment in a block of hundreds, a crime scene hidden in plain sight among the daily lives of ordinary people. Police eventually stumbled upon the truth in 1996, after investigating the discovery of human remains in the river. The trail led back to Spesivtsev's apartment, where the horror was undeniable. Inside they found decomposed remains, evidence of dismemberment, and the chilling signs of just how many had passed through that door. Estimates vary, but investigators believe he may have killed more than 80 people. His mother was arrested as well. The woman who should have been a safeguard had instead become an accomplice, baiting victims for her son. Her betrayal was perhaps the cruelest twist. Because if there is one person the vulnerable might still trust, it is a motherly figure offering warmth in the cold. Lyudmila weaponized that trust, turning it into a lure that brought children to their deaths. When the story broke, it horrified Russia. Not only for the scale of the killings, but for the setting. This was not an isolated farm, not a wilderness cabin. This was a Soviet-era apartment block, with neighbors just a wall away. Ordinary families cooked dinner, argued, and put their children to bed, while next door, other children were being destroyed. It was horror tucked into routine, the monstrous hidden in the mundane. Alexander Spesivtsev was declared legally insane and confined to a psychiatric facility where he remains. His mother received a prison sentence. The dog, innocent in intent but tainted by what it had been fed, was destroyed. And the apartment itself? Stripped bare, its walls carrying secrets no one could bleach away. The Spesivtsev case reminds us that evil doesn't always come dressed as a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it sits behind a door you've walked past 100 times. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor, or even a mother. And sometimes it hides in the quiet sound of a dog chewing in the shadows, eating not scraps of meat but the last remains of lives no one thought to protect. For Novokuznetsk, the nightmare never fully ended. Even today, people remember the smell that crept through the stairwell, the fear that settled over the block, the disbelief that such horrors could unfold just meters away. And for true crime, the name Spesivtsev is carved as one of the darkest examples of how cruelty can take root not in isolation, but in the very heart of community. But even this story is not the final descent, because if a son and his mother could turn an apartment into a slaughterhouse, what happens when two lovers, bound not by blood but by obsession, build their own house of horrors? In Mexico, such a couple would shock the world, not just for their body count, but for the casual way they mixed love, cruelty, and the feeding of their pets into one monstrous routine, the monsters of Ecatepec, love, death, and dogs. Ecatepec is a sprawling suburb on the edge of Mexico City, a place where streets stretch endlessly, crowded with markets, buses, and the clamor of daily life. It's the kind of place where disappearances blur together, where violence is common enough that one more missing person barely raises alarm. But even in a city hardened to tragedy, the story of Juan Carlos Hernandez and Patricia Martinez, the pair later branded the monsters of Ecatepec, was almost too disturbing to believe. They didn't fit the profile of killers in love stories. He was gaunt, with restless eyes. She was heavier, plainer, often quiet in public. Together they looked ordinary, forgettable. But behind the closed door of their cramped home, they built a partnership that thrived on cruelty. Where most couples share meals, secrets, or dreams, Juan Carlos and Patricia shared murder. Their victims were women lured in with promises of work, of babysitting jobs, of small comforts in a city that offered too few. Some were acquaintances, others strangers. Once inside the couple's home, the trap snapped shut. Hernandez was violent, Patricia complicit. The women were killed, dismembered, and their remains scattered in ways that seemed almost designed to humiliate the dead. Parts of bodies were stuffed into buckets and bags, hidden in the filth of their apartment. Other parts were cooked, fried in pans that had once held ordinary meals, and some were fed to the couple's dogs, animals that became unwitting accomplices, devouring the last evidence of lives extinguished. In one chilling detail from their confessions, Hernandez claimed he and Patricia sometimes ate the meat themselves. Whether that was truth or exaggeration hardly matters. The cruelty of the claim alone was enough to sicken a nation. For months, maybe years, no one suspected them. The house looked like any other. The couple walked the streets like any other. Hernandez even prided himself on chatting casually with neighbors, hiding in plain sight. But behind those walls, murder became routine. Patricia admitted she helped lure women and dispose of remains, that her love for Juan Carlos bound her to his sadistic needs. Their romance was cemented not by affection, but by shared blood. The investigation that brought them down began almost by accident. Police were following up on a disappearance when they traced belongings back to the couple. Once inside, the horror unfolded in piles of evidence, bags of bones, clothing of the missing. And in the middle of the chaos, Juan Carlos and Patricia confessed with a kind of ease that chilled investigators to their core. They described their crimes without remorse, sometimes even with pride. The court branded them monsters, and the name stuck. The press called them the monsters of Ecatepec, a couple who had turned love into a weapon, their home into a slaughterhouse. The details spread across Mexico, a country already plagued by violence, but this case cut deeper because of its intimacy. This wasn't cartel brutality or gang warfare. This was domestic, calculated, repeated, and personal. The dogs, like in the other stories, bore no guilt. They ate what they were given. It was the humans who chose. Humans who planned. Humans who reduced women to scraps for pets and for pleasure. The trial ended with life sentences. The apartment was emptied, stripped of the horrors it had contained, but the scars linger. Ecatepec still remembers the couple who walked its streets, shopped at its markets, and returned home to dismember women as casually as others prepared dinner. And if the thought of two lovers conspiring in cruelty feels unbearable, the next story shifts the scene again. This time we return to a quiet farm in the United States, where an older woman lived among her pigs. She didn't lure women. She didn't need to. Her targets were closer, workers, men who trusted her, and when they vanished, the pigs on her land were fed far more than leftovers. Susan Monica, the farm where pigs ate men. In the quiet hills of rural Oregon, far from the noise of Portland and the chaos of city life, sat a 20-acre property owned by a woman named Susan Monica. From a distance, it looked like the kind of place people dream of when they talk about living off the land. Rolling fields, a barn, pens full of pigs, the smell of animals and earth, isolation, independence. But Susan Monica wasn't living a dream. She was building a nightmare. Neighbors described her as eccentric, even intimidating. A heavy-set woman with a blunt way of speaking, she lived alone with her livestock and didn't seem to care for human company. She had fought in the Navy, worked as a welder, and then retreated to the countryside. Some thought she just wanted solitude. Others suspected something darker simmered behind her gruff exterior. Few imagined that on her land, men were being erased in troughs. Her victims weren't strangers pulled off the road. They were men who worked for her. Drifters, laborers, the kind of people who lived paycheck to paycheck and didn't leave much behind. Susan hired them, promised wages, sometimes even a roof over their heads. But when they crossed her, when she decided they were no longer useful, they vanished. In 2012, one of those men, Robert Haney, a handyman, suddenly disappeared. His family called police after weeks of silence. At first, suspicion didn't land on Susan. She told investigators he had left abruptly, leaving his belongings behind. But the belongings included his cell phone, his ID, his tools. He hadn't gone anywhere. Months later, another man vanished, Stephen Delicino, who had also been living and working on her farm. That was when police began to look harder, and what they found was almost too grotesque to process. On Susan's property, scattered across pens and buried shallow in the mud, were human remains. Bones stripped clean, fragments chewed down. And in the troughs where her pigs fed, investigators found traces of human tissue. The truth was undeniable. Susan Monica had murdered men and fed their bodies to her pigs. When confronted, she didn't deny it. In fact, her words shocked investigators. She admitted to killing, admitted to feeding the pigs, and then she added something that left the courtroom frozen. She said it was practical. That was her logic. Practical. The pigs ate everything. They left no trace. To her, it was efficient, tidy, final. The men were gone and the pigs were full. In her mind, that was enough. Her trial painted a picture of cold calculation. This wasn't a sudden snap of rage or an accident hidden in panic. It was a system. She found vulnerable men, used them, and when she decided their time was up, she let her pigs finish the story. The animals weren't accomplices. They were tools. Tools she fed and tools that erased. The jury convicted her of murdering both men. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison. She'll die behind bars. But her case lingers as one of the most chilling reminders of how easily practicality can become a mask for horror. Because Susan Monica didn't see herself as a monster. She saw herself as a farmer solving problems. And that may be the most terrifying part of all. But the trail doesn't end in Oregon. Thousands of miles away in Japan, another killer used animals not just as disposal, but as cover. His business was dogs, his livelihood was kennels, and his victims disappeared into the very place people trusted to care for their pets. His name was Sekine, and his crimes blurred the line between caretaker and butcher. Sekine, the kennel of disappearance, Saitama, Japan, a city of apartment blocks, neon signs, and the steady rhythm of commuter trains. It's the kind of place where people keep their heads down, where neighbors nod politely but don't ask questions, where anonymity is easy. And in that anonymity, a man named Sekine built a business that should have been ordinary. He bred dogs. He ran a kennel. On the surface, he was just another man making a living from Japan's deep love of pets. But his kennel was not a sanctuary. It was a cover. And for some, it was the last place they were ever seen alive. Sekine was not a madman in rags or a recluse hiding in shadows. He was social, charming when he wanted to be, and confident in a way that put people at ease. That mask allowed him to lure victims, often people tied to shady business deals or disputes over money. Once they stepped inside his world, once the door shut behind them, they were trapped. The method was simple and brutal. Sekine killed, dismembered, and disposed of bodies in ways that left little trace. Some accounts say he fed parts to the dogs under his care. Others suggest he relied on chemicals, burning and crushing to scatter what remained. What mattered wasn't the exact process. What mattered was that it worked. People vanished, and the dogs and kennels gave him an excuse for every smell, every sound, every odd stain. Neighbors smelled rot. He said it was animal waste. Strange noises, just the dogs, buckets and tools no one recognized. Part of the business. It was almost perfect. Almost. The truth began to surface in the early 1990s, when investigators tied a missing couple back to Sekine's orbit. The trail led to his kennel. The evidence they uncovered was grim. Belongings of the missing, forensic traces that should never have been there. Stories that contradicted his carefully built mask. Bit by bit, the facade crumbled. When Sekine was arrested and put on trial, Japan watched in disbelief. The case didn't feel like something from their orderly society. It felt foreign, grotesque, like a nightmare imported from somewhere else. But it wasn't. It was homegrown. It had been hiding in plain sight, shielded by the very thing people trusted. A kennel full of barking dogs. What made the story cut deeper was the betrayal of that trust. Dogs, for centuries symbols of loyalty and safety, became unwilling props in a killer's theater. Their presence explained away the smells, the waste, the noise. They gave Sekine camouflage even if they weren't truly fed what he claimed. The mere suggestion was enough to stain the case forever. In the end, Sekine was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. He waits on death row, a reminder that killers can hide behind any mask, even the mask of an animal lover. His kennels are gone now, his dogs dispersed. But the memory lingers, whispered in Saitama, as the case that proved evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it comes with wagging tails and the promise of care. Dogs in China, pigs in Canada, kennels in Japan. It feels like a chain stretching across continents, linking killers who never knew each other but thought the same way. Erase life through animals. The animals were never the monsters. The monsters were always the people who fed them. Because in the end, whether it's a dog licking blood from a floor, a pig devouring flesh in a trough, or a kennel hiding the stench of decay, the horror is not in the pets at all. It's in the humans who looked at life and saw nothing but meat. Because in the end, whether it's a dog licking blood from a floor, a pig devouring flesh in a trough, or a kennel hiding the stench of decay, the horror is not in the animals at all. It's in the humans who looked at life and saw nothing but meat.